Alright, recently I read a book called Nikola Tesla and the Cabbage Patch Kids by Guy Anderson, and I found it to be a very interesting read. So, the book deals a lot with the Tartaria theory, which I'm sure many people are already familiar with, but if you're not, it's essentially an alternative or hidden history theory. Now, I personally don't agree with everything put forward in that theory. I think it has a lot of holes in it, but I do think it raises some genuinely interesting questions. Now, one section of the book that really caught my attention was Anderson's claim about the original purpose of cathedrals and churches. What he suggests is that these buildings were not originally used as places of worship, but instead they were being used as places of healing. So let's get into it. According to Anderson, cathedrals were designed to harness and store energy from the ether. He says this was done using cathodes, which are a type of electrode that moves electrons. In simple terms, the idea is that certain metals used in the construction of these buildings could receive energy and store it within the building itself. He then argues that this stored energy was released through frequencies and that the way cathedrals are designed are what made this work. The arches and windows we see in almost every cathedral are said to be cymatic in nature. Cymatics are patterns formed by sound and vibration, and examples of these shapes include hexagons, pentagons, and octagons. Anderson claims these shapes can produce frequencies that can have a healing effect on the human body. According to this theory, when people entered these buildings, the frequencies being emitted will create feelings of calm euphoria and even physical healing. Now, whether or not you buy that, it is interesting because there has been legitimate research for decades into frequency-based healing, so I just thought I'd throw that in there. Anderson also points to church bells and church organs as a part of this system. He suggests that the sound produced by church bells and organ pipes emitted frequencies that worked with the architecture of the building. He actually raises a very interesting question as to why an instrument inside a church is called an organ. Is it because this instrument emits frequencies that can help human organs? Food for thought. He then references the work of Royal Raymond Rife, an inventor who believed that disease was caused by bacteria and that it could be treated using specific frequencies. Rife developed a machine that produced low-level electromagnetic waves, and he claimed that by matching a frequency of a disease, it could be destroyed. This work was ridiculed by mainstream science, but Anderson uses it to support the idea that frequency-based healing must have been understood in the past. He also raises some architectural questions. For example, why do so many old churches have weather vanes on top of them? Were they just decorative? Or were they being used to monitor the weather so that energy could be harnessed more effectively? Or maybe they were just monitoring the weather, who knows? He also points out that cymatic design requires an advanced knowledge of mathematics and very precise planning. He questions whether it's realistic to believe that every village hundreds of years ago just so happened to have a craftsman capable of designing such complex structures without a shared knowledge system. Another detail he mentions is the pine cone imagery that is found inside many churches and cathedrals, as the pine cone has long been a symbol for the pineal gland, which is linked to perception and consciousness. He also claims that the original stained glass windows were not simply coloured glass, but were actually made from crystals. According to him, each colour represented a different chakra, and people would enter these buildings to meditate, heal, and rebalance themselves. Now, one of the more controversial claims that he makes is that much of this was deliberately altered. He suggests that the original church bells were taken down and used as ammunition in World War II. He claims that organs were redesigned and that the crystals in the windows were replaced with coloured glass, and this is why these buildings no longer have the same effect that they once did. Alright, so there are some very bold and some genuinely interesting ideas put forward here by Guy Anderson. And my own thoughts on how plausible they are pretty mixed. On one hand, you've got these incredibly complex and, let's be real, incredibly beautiful structures in the forms of cathedrals. And you do have to ask yourselves, did our ancestors really go to such lengths purely for places of worship? I'm not dismissing that outright, as people in the past definitely took their faith very seriously, probably much more so than today. That being said, it is interesting that cathedrals all over the world share so many of the same features. You've got the windows, the arches, the bells, the organs, etc. And especially when you consider that so many of them were built during periods when communication between countries, let alone continents, was supposed to be extremely limited. If these buildings were only places of worship, you do start to wonder about the similarities. If they were places of healing, however, it does make a lot more sense, as the building would have to follow a certain design in order for it to function. Now, that being said, the notion that there was a coordinated worldwide effort to repurpose these buildings, it's a bit of a stretch to me, truth be told. I mean, the level of cooperation and organisation across different empires and nations a couple hundred years ago requires some mental gymnastics. Now, I'm not dismissing the idea, and to be fair to Anderson, he does mention a possible global reset that could have allowed this to happen, but that's another rabbit hole, so I'm very much on the fence with this theory, truth be told. Anyway, with all that in mind, I will say that this book is a very interesting read, and it's full of some really fascinating concepts, and I will definitely be returning to it in future videos to discuss some of the other ideas that Anderson puts forward, so I'll leave it at that.